All right, welcome everybody. Super excited you could join us. And thank you for putting up with the shifting schedules. It's sometimes happens, especially when we're trying to get a fantastic speaker like we have tonight. Stephanie Wang from Harvard College and a former Science Olympiad alum from Seven Lakes High School. I'm Dr. John Lohr. If you haven't attended one of these, I'm in the national office working on content, events, resources. Tonight, like I said, we're going to have Stephanie is going to share with you disease detectives tips and tricks. Now, a couple of usual details. So Vivi, who just threw in the chat, yes, the presentation will be shared. The recording will be shared. The recording is going to be shared in two ways. As soon as the cloud recording is available, sometime tomorrow, you'll get a link to go see the cloud recording. And we will put the presentation up on the Science Olympiad workshop page. So you can download the presentation and everything there. Then later this week, we're going to do some stuff to the video, kind of clean it up, make sure that the long conversation Stephanie and I were having in the beginning gets trimmed off, make sure the awkward face I'm going to make at the end when I hit stop recording, that gets trimmed off. And then it will be posted on our Science Olympiad YouTube channel, Science Olympiad TV. So anybody can sign up and watch, or anyone can go there and watch it. All right. Now, if you want to get a hold of us, there are two ways to interact with us tonight. First and foremost, if you guys would right now, use the chat and tell us who you are, where you're at, what division you're in. Right? Are you middle school or are you high school? That would be really helpful if you would put that in the chat. So Stephanie has a sense of, who our audience is tonight. The other thing you can put in the chat would be to add things like, if you hit something goes wrong, or you're like, hey, wait a minute, my screen froze. Is that just me? Is that you guys? All of a sudden my audio drops off. Please go ahead and put that in if you've got any of those kind of questions, put them in the chat. And we'll try and get an answer for you and let us know what's going on. If you have a question about disease detectives, you have a question about anything that Stephanie shares with you, if you look in your toolbar, it's kind of in the middle on the right-hand side, like just to the right of the middle of your toolbar, you should see the box with a question mark, and it says Q&A under that. Please go ahead and throw your questions in there. Cool thing about that is, unlike the chat, Q&A, the questions don't really move up and down and they don't get lost. So we'd prefer you go ahead and throw your questions in there. Use the chat for either, letting us know if something's going wrong, and also talk to Stephanie. It sounds like she's going to try and make this interactive. So if you have any kind of responses to questions she may ask or ideas about what she's talking about and wants you to respond, please put that stuff in the chat as well. All right. Now, if there are no other immediate questions or concerns, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Wang and let her take it from here. Stephanie, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, John, for having me. I'm super excited to be here to share some disease detectives tips and tricks with you guys. And thank you, John, again for that really kind introduction. And like John mentioned, today this presentation is meant to be as interactive as possible. So I'm going to be asking a bunch of questions in the middle of the presentation. So like John mentioned, you can just throw out your answer in the chat. And so I'm going to kind of build off of your responses and try to maximize your learning experience for the next hour. So yeah, without further ado, we can go ahead and get started. So as a quick agenda for today, we're going to start off with some strategies for success, not just for disease detectives, but for overall study events that I've had experience with for the past 6 years that I've been competing with Science Olympiad, and specifically about preparation, resources that would be helpful for the event, various study tips that, have helped me along the way, as well as note-making tips, which I know many of you guys are working on. And then after that, we're going to go through a case study, and we're going to answer questions from the case study. And this is kind of the part that I'd really like you to be interactive and answer any questions that I pose. So we're going to go through the initial investigation, diagnosis, a little talk about stats and epicurves, and then a little bit of data analysis for you guys. And then finally, I want to end with a quick little summary of how Disease Detectives is not just a Science Olympiad event and how it can have really great real-world ramifications for making you an informed and civically engaged person. So yeah, that's kind of the broad strokes overview of what we plan to do for tonight. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm a junior at Harvard studying molecular and cellular biology on the pre-med track. I graduated from Seven Lakes High School in Houston, Katy, Texas in 2022. And from seventh grade to 12th grade, I competed in Science Olympiad. I went to Beckendorf Junior High. So that was where I launched my Scioli journey. And some of the topics or the events that I've competed in are anatomy and physiology, disease detectives, protein modeling, and occasionally nowadays I write tests, mainly disease detective tests for some past tournaments like BirdSO and HUSO, which is the Harvard Science Olympiad. So yeah, to get started, I'm going to share some tips on general strategies for how to do well in Science Olympiad that kind of extend for most, if not all, study events. So the first one is reading books. Um, I know many people enjoy, finding lists of topics and kind of Googling them online, which is definitely a great approach if that works for you. However, in my experience, reading a textbook was really the best way to get a comprehensive overview of the important topics within that subject that you're studying. So I'm going to give some examples of good disease detectives textbooks in the next few slides. But yeah, that's the first step that I would recommend to anyone. And then the second one is Science Olympiad is such a collaborative event. You get to work in partners, you get to work in a team setting, and that is a really valuable environment for fostering collaboration and learning from each other and even teaching each other like concepts. And that is such a valuable skill that definitely you should not underestimate. So whenever you can, collaborate with your teammates on notes and hold meetings and share interesting ideas that you find throughout the literature. And then the third step would be to attend as many competitions as humanly possible, or that your school will support you to do. Um, I found that in the beginning, when I was going to my very first tournament, it was so nerve-wracking. There's a lot of adrenaline, and maybe you don't perform the best, but over time, if you go to your ninth or your 10th competition, those nerves, they kind of settle down a little bit, and you can really maximize your potential. And I think it's the best way to practice for state and nationals and regionals is to compete in as many competitions as you can. So those are the three big things. And now to be a little bit more specific about how to prepare for study events and for disease detectives. First step would be to find resources that are helpful for you. And like I mentioned, textbooks, and then Khan Academy is a really good resource for those of you guys who are more visual learners or audio learners. Um, I found that especially for life sciences events like anatomy and physiology, they're super helpful to walk you through the various logic that you need to understand some of these complex systems. And then this might be slightly controversial, but I found Wikipedia to be really helpful for me when I was learning about more niche subjects that we'll touch on in disease detectives. And then secondly, as you're reading and understanding these resources, I would highly recommend you to create notes alongside the learning process. And this is because in the process of creating notes, you're actively thinking about what are the most important concepts that I need to take away from this article or from this textbook chapter. And through that process, you're already kind of synthesizing information for yourself, and it makes you retain the information a lot better. So as you're making your notes for Scioli, try to think about, where or what is the main idea of this, and then you can add on the details later, and that'll really help you learn the material. And don't you should definitely not write things in your notes without understanding them. So that's the whole point of creating good notes. And then the third step would be to take as many practice tests as you can as well. So scioli.org has a really extensive test exchange. Sometimes asking your captains or your coaches, they can help you find additional resources for practice tests. But my main advice for this is to take them under real contest circumstances. So timed, and it's really tempting, but don't control F in your notes or do anything that, you can't actually access in the real competition. So yeah, those are like my three steps to how to really get good at a Science Olympiad event. Okay, and I just also wanted to put a disclaimer that a lot of these tricks that I'm sharing are what worked best for me, so I would highly recommend you to experiment with different strategies and find what works best for you as well. So, like I mentioned, the magic formula is the one that works best for you, but this kind of cycle is what I found to be really helpful for improving my understanding of disease detectives and other study events. Okay, so the first one is to read, as meant read, read, read. Okay, so skim through the textbook of your choice and write down your own notes as you're learning the material. Synthesize that information into what you believe to be the most valuable components. And then after that, practice tests, scour publicly available tests from previous tournaments, take them under time conditions, and track your progress. It's really, really great for you to be able to see how you're improving throughout the competition season. And then as you're practicing, you want to keep a rolling dock of content that you're maybe not so sure about or that contain practice questions that you missed or introduce new concepts from the tests that you still need to review. So it's actually really interesting because I recently have been studying for, exams in school and for, other important exams, and this is the same exact strategy that I use for any exam that I study for. It all derived from my experience in Science Olympiad. And I always have that rolling dock of content that includes all the important information that I need to review and that I can skim through and see every single day when I'm looking through, you know, a new practice test or reading about a new article. So definitely recommend that strategy. And then finally, as you're taking a lot of practice tests, as you're reading a lot of textbook chapters, and as you're going through that rolling dock of content, you'll start to see a lot of patterns that will make you a better test taker. So, in the context of disease detectives, many of you guys may see the same types of questions like, what are the steps of an outbreak investigation? Or name this type of epicurve, or like write a case definition. So these are all really, really common question types that you'll start to see and you'll start to master as you begin to recognize and solidify these patterns in the tests. And then, rinse and repeat until competition day. So that's kind of the four-step process that I take when I am doing disease detectives or when I'm just trying to learn a new event or any new concept or studying for any test. So yeah. All right. Now moving on to finding the right resources, which is definitely a very important starting point for disease detectives. So like I mentioned earlier, textbooks are a great place to start, but sometimes it's hard to wade through the waters of all the hundreds of textbooks that are offered to you. So these were just three that I found to be the most helpful for me in preparing for this event, and I've ordered them in terms of difficulty. So the first one is the CDC textbook called Principles of Epidemiology and Public Health Practice. It's a great introduction to the field. It's free and completely available online. So I've included a link, so I'm sure you guys can access it after the presentation, but definitely would recommend reading through it first. The great thing I like about this textbook is that it also has embedded questions that you can answer to help you solidify your understanding of the concept. Um, so yeah, great intro. And then if you're looking for a little bit more of a challenge, or if you've mastered those basic concepts, Gordis Epidemiology is kind of like the gold standard epidemiology books that I heard many of my teammates were using as well, beyond just me. So it's a pretty comprehensive, intro-friendly epidemiology textbook that covers almost every single concept that I've seen in disease detectives, and definitely worth it to kind of invest and skim at least. Okay, so then moving on to the last resource that I'd recommend for this event. This one is a little bit more advanced. There's a little bit more of the advanced concepts that show up in this book, like biostatistics and data analysis. But I really, really, really like this book because it taught me a lot more of kind of like the why behind certain concepts. For example, why do we use the odds ratio for case control studies, and why do we use the relative risk for cohort studies? And it would teach me a lot about like the different types of biases, give you examples of those, and it would help like walk you through the math of a lot of the calculation type questions that you'd see in disease detectives. But I think the learning curve is a little bit higher for this book. But if you're up for that additional challenge, I would highly recommend it. I think it's certainly worth it. So yeah, those are my three books that I swore by when I was studying for this event. And, in that order, I would recommend it to any student who's interested in getting involved in this event. Okay, now moving on to note-taking tips. So, of course, another very important component of disease detectives is making good notes that you can bring with you to tournament day. And one quick thing about notes is that the next few tips I'm about to show you are, again, what worked best for me and knowledge that I kind of learned from my time at Seven Lakes, from my captains, and kind of from my teammates. These were kind of the helpful, like the tips and tricks that kind of we passed down by word of mouth throughout generations. So I wanted to share these tips with you guys because I know note taking is a really big part of this event. Okay, so the first thing is to paraphrase. Um, I know it's really tempting to copy paste, from websites and put that into your notes, but I found that it's a little bit counterintuitive. I'm sorry, it's a little counterproductive to do that because when you're copy pasting, you're not actively thinking about the message and the concept behind that phrase. Whereas if you're really paraphrasing and rewriting in your own words the things that you're learning about on websites or in textbooks, then you're going to have a much better grasp of that material. And sometimes whenever you're copy pasting, a lot of the words that you're going to be including are jargon. So on competition day, you're not going to understand it that well. You're not going to know how to apply it that well. And on competition day, you really don't have time to be reading your notes for the first time and understanding it for the first time. So I would highly recommend paraphrasing as the first step to making good notes. And then the second one is a highlighting system. So this one differs, you can use a different highlighting system for anyone, but for me it was headings were blue, subheadings were green, and definitions were yellow. And then I have, if I needed more layers, I just add more colors, but having like a good highlighting system that you stick to throughout the course of the competition cycle is really, really helpful, especially for notes with page limits where you really need to know where everything is. Okay, and then next was using Microsoft Word. So I know some students like to use Google Docs to format notes because it's easier to share with their partners, which I totally fair. But from my experience, I found that Microsoft Word is like a lot easier to manipulate, to format, and to just move things around and, save space. So I'll give you guys a little bit of a tutorial in a little bit, but Microsoft Word would be my recommended software. And then finally, some space-saving formatting using text boxes, reducing the margin size, and single spacing. And then also turning off image compress, which I'll get into a little bit later. So those are my big note-taking tips for you guys. So this is just kind of in addition to that, I would highly also recommend including images in your notes. So for example, if you don't have the chain of infection memorized, I would recommend including a photo of the chain of infection. Or if you don't have certain epicurve types memorized, I would also recommend including pictures of certain epicurves. But one thing that tends to happen with images is they tend to be blurry when you print them out. So this is a quick little trick that I like to do to make sure that my photos come out crystal clear. So changing the image size and quality setting to ensure that it's put on high fidelity and that you don't compress the images. And that way, when you print the notes out, it's going to look really nice and you're going to be able to see it very well on competition day. And then the next one are just some thoughts that I had on text box formatting. I'm not going to go super in depth to this because, I know you guys came here to learn about disease detectives, but text box is a great way to format and organize your notes. And then changing your margins to 0.17 by 0.17, which I learned the hard way is the smallest that you can make them to allow them to still be printable. And then setting your margins to size 0. This is like the way that you can maximize your space to allow for note taking. Feel free to ask me any questions later on about notes, but yeah, these are like some tricks that I learned throughout the years. Okay, so next I'm going to pause real quick because for the next part of this presentation, we're going to be walking through a sample case study. And these questions are pulled from the 2023 BirdSo Invitational Division C Disease Detectives Test that I wrote a couple years ago. And you can find that publicly available via sciley.org or through the BirdSo website if you want to either like follow along or do the test later after the webinar. So yeah, um, I'm gonna go ahead and answer questions in a little bit, but to start off, I'm gonna share kind of the setting for the case study. So, disclaimer, this is a completely made up case study. This is not based on real events. So, you work for the Harris County Public Health Department in Harris County, Texas, and in July 2017, you received several phone calls in a short span of time reporting a mysterious disease from local hospitals in which patients are presenting with watery diarrhea, greasy stools, dehydration, abdominal cramps, and fatigue. Okay, so that is the case study setting the stage for that. And then I'll come back to this slide later if you guys need more time to read it. Okay, so for part of the initial investigation, these are some questions that I wanted to ask you guys. So like I mentioned, please feel free to include what you want to say in the chat, and I want to make this as interactive as possible. All right, so starting off with the first question, does this constitute an outbreak? Why or why not? So feel free to share what you think to this question in the group chat, and then I will kind of answer accordingly. So what do you guys think? Yes or no? Okay, I'm getting a couple answers, which is great. Okay, interesting. Perfect. I'm getting some great answers in the chat. So let's talk about what you need, what criteria you need to be classified as an outbreak. So the first thing that you need for a situation like that to be classified as an outbreak is first, we need to know, is the volume of phone calls greater than expected? So we need to know the baseline. How many people normally how many people normally call in to say that they've had these symptoms? And then we need to establish that it's the outbreak. Sorry, in order to establish an outbreak, we need to make sure that the volume of phone calls that we're getting right now is greater than the expected number of phone calls that we get. So that we need to know. Second thing we need to know is, are these patients suffering from the same disease? So is it just one person? Is it just, maybe there's different types of gastrointestinal diseases and we're not sure exactly that they're the same. So in this case, if we go back to the previous case study, you'll notice that it doesn't say that there's a greater than sorry, there doesn't say that there's a greater than normal number of cases. And it also doesn't say that they're all in the same type of disease. So because of that, we normally would not have enough information in this case to immediately classify it as an outbreak. However, we can say that because they're localized in the same period of time and in the same location geographically, we could call this a cluster of cases, but we can't just yet say that it is an outbreak. So just be careful with that sometimes because it can be a little tricky differentiating a cluster versus an outbreak. But a lot of you guys were on the right track, so good for you. All right, so the next question, list and describe 5 reasons why it's important to investigate outbreaks. So these types of questions are typically more of like, you just want to be creative, they're pretty generic, and you guys feel free to send 1 or more reasons that you think we should investigate this outbreak in the chat.
Hey, Stephanie,
Yeah?
before you get going, Anaya looks like she had a question about, could you just touch on the difference between a cluster and an outbreak so
Yes.
everybody understands that we're on the same page?
Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you for the question. And this is a great question. So, a cluster is essentially a group of cases that occur within a localized time in a localized geographic location. However, the main difference is that an outbreak, you need to establish that the number of cases that you're getting is higher than the baseline. Whereas a cluster, you don't need that condition. So, because in this case, we don't know that the number of cases that we're getting is higher than the expected number, we can't immediately conclude that it's an outbreak. However, because it's localized in time and space, we can only say that it's a cluster. So hopefully that helps you a little bit. Yeah, thank you, John, for pointing that out. Um, great. So I'm getting some really good responses regarding the reasons why we want to investigate outbreaks. So these types of questions, you'll get them all the time. And these are the types of questions that I think would be really worthy to just put it in your notes somewhere that you know is there and you can just refer to them whenever you see them on a test. So these are some questions. These are just some that I listed. Control and prevention of the health problem, opportunity to learn as a research opportunity, respond to public, political, or legal concerns, public health program considerations, and as a training opportunity. So these, they tend to happen very early on in the case study portion of each test. And as long as you have a response that, makes sense, they'll typically give you credit for it. But if you just have reasons in your notes, you can just refer to them, copy them down, and move on. So yeah. All right, great answers to this. Thank you so much, you guys, for interacting with me. Okay, next question is super important one. Write a case definition for this mysterious disease with the information that you have been given. So you guys don't need to type out the entire case definition if you don't, you don't have to do that. But I do want to ask you guys if you know the components that are necessary of a case definition. So what do you need to include in a case definition in order to get full credit? Great, I'm seeing some good answers. Okay, this is perfect. Yeah, so we have person, which if you refer back to my case study, they're hospital patients. Place, Harris County, Texas. Time, July 2017. And then lastly, you need clinical information. So if it tells you there's lab confirmation, that would count as clinical information. If there's no lab confirmation and instead it's just symptoms, that counts as clinical information. So basically, whatever it tells you in the initial aspect of the question, you want to include that as the clinical information. So these are some of the most common question types you'll see in disease detectives. So it's highly worth it to practice writing case definitions often and get familiar with these four components and make sure you can extract them quickly from the question. All right, you guys did amazing in this first section of the initial investigation. And if there aren't any major questions, oh, I see a couple questions. Okay, someone asked if a case definition needs to be an essay or you can just say it in the location colon Texas. Yeah. So um I think it's a better bet to do it in a paragraph format just because that's like a more professional way of writing a case definition. So that would just be my recommendation. Some tests you can get away with just doing the person, hospital, place, Harris County, Texas, like I did right here, but in paragraph, I think that would make sure that you get full points. And Nancy asked if there's a specific format or order for the case definition. Uh, the order does not matter. As long as you have these components written in there, you should be totally fine. All right, awesome, you guys. Let's move on to the next component, which is the diagnosis is in. So after a few days, you're told by the lab that these patients have all tested positive for Giardia lamblia, which is the pathogen that causes giardiasis. Okay, so by a quick show of answers in the chat, does anyone know off the top of their head what kind of pathogen Giardia lamblia is? Like what class, or yeah, just what type of pathogen are they? Great, I'm seeing great answers. So they are a parasite. More specifically, Giardia is a protozoa. So great job, you guys. So the question that I'm going to ask you guys as part of the case study is, the incubation period of Giardia is about 1 to 14 days with an average of about 7 days. What is an incubation period and why does it exist? So feel free to write your answers down in the chat. You can answer just part or both both parts of the question. Feel free to, you know, exactly whatever you would like to say. Lovely. Great answers from everyone. Yeah, so you guys all seem to be experts on incubation periods, but essentially it's the amount of time that, or the period of time from when you first get exposed to the pathogen to when you first start experiencing symptoms. So for Giardia, that's about 1 to 14 days, with a median of about 7 days that you need to wait between exposure to onset of symptoms, like the diarrhea and fever that we talked about earlier. And why does it exist? So essentially, when a pathogen enters your body, it needs time to invade and establish itself and cause symptoms. So that's kind of the reason. So this is what I wrote. An incubation period is the period of time between exposure to the pathogen and onset of symptoms. It takes time for the pathogen to establish itself in the body and for an immune response to be elicited, which is when the onset of symptoms occurs. So these are examples of kind of biology-esque questions that you may see on case studies. And so some basic microbiology is fair game for most disease detective tests. So back what I used to do was I used to have a text box in my notes, just having information about some of the most common types of infectious diseases, the pathogens associated with it, the symptoms, the name of the pathogen, just have some basic understanding of various types of microbes that could cause an infection or an outbreak. All right. Um, okay, so I'm gonna move on to the next part, which is to investigate. This is moving on more to like the specific information and math associated with the case study. So to collect more information about the outbreak, you interview each GRDS's patient. What are 3 important questions that you should ask each patient that will assist you in solving the outbreak? Okay, so feel free to send any answers that you may think about in the chat. And for these types of questions, you just want to be creative. And honestly, whatever questions that you ask, as long as it can tie back to the central goal of the outbreak investigation, that should be an appropriate question. Yeah, I'm seeing great answers. What were your symptoms? Were you exposed to anyone with the disease? When did you notice the symptoms? Yeah, these are all great answers. Where have you been recently? Great. Okay, so these were some questions that I thought about. When did you start experiencing symptoms? What aquatic areas have you been to in the past week? Who did you go with to these said aquatic areas to see if there's anyone else who we need to interview? What symptoms are you experiencing to make sure that they match with Giardia? And how long after going to the aquatic area did you start experiencing symptoms? So these are all just examples, but feel free to be creative when it comes to these types of questions. Yeah, that's the whole purpose. Okay, moving on. So now to the fun part. Personally, my favorite part of each case study was always the stats. So representatives of the Harris County Public Health Department interviewed 34 patients infected, and among the 34, 27 of them reported to have visited the Harris County Aquatic Center sometime before the outbreak occurred. The Public Health Committee also interviewed 40 patients who are not infected, and amongst those, 10 reported to have visited the Harris County Aquatic Center. Epidemiologists are currently investigating this case. Okay, great. So, my question to you guys is, what type of epidemiological study is being conducted and why? As always, feel free to share in the chat. Great, I'm seeing the correct answer from most of you guys. So, let's kind of walk through how we can get to the answer. So there's 2 main types of epidemiological studies that you'll be tested on. There's some others that, you should also know, but the main 2 are cohort study and case control study. So the main difference between a cohort study and a case control study is the order by which you explore the exposure versus the outcome. So in a cohort study, you separate your interviewees by exposure. So you first determine if someone went to this Harris County Aquatic Center, and then you follow up with them to see whether or not they contracted GRDSs. In contrast, in a case control study, you start with the people who have the disease and a separate group of a separate group of controls who don't have the disease. And then you move backwards in time to see, did these people go to the Harris County Aquatic Center? So what's going on here? Sorry, one second. I'm having some technical issues. But essentially, we started off with oh, sorry guys. That's my bad. Okay. So we started off with some with the outcome, which is that we started with the patients versus people who don't have the disease, and then we traced back their exposure, as in whether or not they went to the Harris County Aquatic Center. So because we started with the outcome and then we go back to the exposure, we are doing a case control study. So you guys were correct. Great job on this question. And I think it's especially important to be able to differentiate. Sorry, one second. I'm having some issues with annotation, but there we go. Um, it's especially important to differentiate between cohort and case control when it comes to case study or outbreak investigation questions, because that will also determine the type of statistic that you're going to use for calculating either relative risk or odds ratio. So I would also recommend practicing a lot, looking at different case study descriptions and being able to immediately identify whether you're working with a case control study or whether you're working with a cohort study. Okay, lovely. So now, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm having some technical issues, but moving on to the next part, you'll also get some questions about epidemic curves, also known as epicurves, and I just wanted to touch on the four main types of epicurves that you'll see typically in tests. So the first one is a continuous common source epicurve, which occurs in which people are exposed to a single source of infection over a really long period of time, and so that photo I have there is an example of what a continuous common source epicurve would look like. So you see that it's throughout a pretty lengthy period of time, and the cases, they don't change drastically. It's not like you go immediately up and immediately down. So an example of a continuous common source outbreak would be like an infected well of water being used for months. No one's taking care of that infected well, so people are continuously being infected over time until the source of infection is removed. And then that's in contrast to a point source outbreak in which there's a single source of infection over a brief period of time. For example, if some salmonella food poisoning was served at a dinner party. So you see this spike in cases immediately after the dinner party, but then, after people have recovered, the cases decline. And that's because that's a single source, and then as soon as it's over, there's no more new cases being initiated. So an example, like I said, an infected oyster dish at a dinner party. So next, we're going to move on to intermittent common source outbreaks. Or sorry, intermittent common source epicurves. So these typically happen when people are exposed to a single source of infection over intermittent time periods. But there's time in between different exposures. So it could be the same exposure, but it's not a continuous exposure to the uh, same antigen or pathogen or whatever. So, for example, Lyme disease is more common in summer. So if you look at the epicurve for Lyme disease, you'll see these like point source looking outbreaks, but they'll happen every summer. So if you zoom out into multiple years, you'll see these spikes in cases during the summer. And that's because you'll get Lyme disease more often in the summers. Okay, and then lastly, we have propagated. So you guys might be very familiar with these types of epicurves because that's what COVID looked like. And these are typically occurring in diseases that can be spread from person to person. So, for example, like the flu that can be transmitted. And each successive peak is essentially a new wave of the disease. And they typically get higher with time because this first wave of people, you can see that first little small peak there, that's the initial group of people who contracted the disease. And then they're going to infect it to their surroundings. And then you'll get the second peak. And that's going to be taller because you have more people infected. And then those people will infect it to the third wave. So you'll get the third peak. So these propagated outbreaks, they're typically pretty easy to discern. Just look at successively higher peaks that occur over time. And if it's an infectious disease, then you'll know for sure it's a propagated source outbreak. Some interesting things about that you can learn from propagated source outbreaks. Just from looking at this graph, you can actually tell the incubation period of the disease. So does anyone know how they can tell the incubation period of the disease just based off of this graph? Great. So people are giving me great answers. So yeah, exactly. It's going to be the time in between the peaks. So between two peaks, that's kind of the time when the next group of people will start to get their symptoms, and you can estimate that using that method. Another really cool thing about propagated is you can also kind of estimate the basic reproduction number of the disease, although we're not going to get super into detail about that. But essentially, comparing the height of the peaks, you can kind of estimate how easily transmissible is this disease. Okay, now moving on. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through the Q&A just to see. All right. So yes, so just to clarify a little bit about cohort and case control, Jared asked about retrospective cohort and case control. So the rule of thumb is that regardless of what type of cohort study you're talking about, you're always starting from exposure and then going to outcome. Whereas in case control, it's always going to be outcome and then going back to exposure. The difference between a retrospective cohort reaction, sorry, a retrospective cohort study and a case control study is that order. However, you are for both of these going to be going back in time. So for a retrospective cohort study, you're starting with um, both the exposure and the outcome have already occurred. So you're looking at the exposure and then you're going to trace and look at the outcome. However, both of them have already occurred. So it's not like you're following these patients over time to see whether or not they get the disease. If you do that, then that's a prospective cohort study. Um, and Anai, you're basically right, except it's instead of case study, it's case control study. But yeah, great. And then I will answer a little bit more about like practical questions about doing disease detective tests after I get through this case study. So just hold tight with that question. Okay, great. Now moving on to the next part, which is the fun part. So calculate and interpret the appropriate measure of risk. So I already provided the 2 by 2 table to you guys. And normally during contests, you can just follow this format where you have your disease versus no disease, and then you have your exposure versus no exposure, and then just fill in the corresponding blanks based on the information that you're given in the question. So, given that we already established that we're doing a case control study, does anyone want to tell me what measure of risk we should be using? Hint, there are two. There's relative risk or odds ratio. Do you guys have an idea of which one we should be using? Lovely. You guys are super on top of it. It is going to be the odds ratio. So case control studies, you always use the odds ratio, whereas cohort studies, you always use the relative risk. And if you want to learn more about the reason, I can give you a quick little summary, but essentially the odds ratio is just an estimate of the relative risk. And we use odds ratio because case control studies are retrospective, meaning they go back in time. So that's kind of the the 10,000-foot view of why. But if you want a deeper dive into that, the Ashton and Siege book that I shared earlier gives you a really, really good explanation. Okay, so the formula for a odds ratio is AD over BC. So A is 27, B is 10, um, C is 7, and D is 30. So you just do the diagonals essentially. You multiply 27 by 30, and then you divide that by all of 10 times 7. And so I already provided the calculation for you guys. It's going to be about 11.57. And I included a quick little note here that you should always show your work during disease detectives test because even if you, for example, mess up the calculation, you can always get partial credit if you just include, for example, the formula or if you just show that you've plugged in the correct numbers. Usually the grader will try to give you partial credit in that case. All right, so the last task for this page that I'd like you guys to do is kind of interpret what does this 11.57 odds ratio mean? How does that relate the exposure and the outcome? So feel free to type your answer in the chat. So essentially just to interpret the appropriate measure of risk. Great. I'm getting some good answers. Perfect, perfect. Awesome. All right, so this is what I wrote. I said the odds of visiting the Harris County Aquatic Center were 11.6 times more likely among cases compared to controls. This high odds ratio makes it very likely that the source of contamination that led to this outbreak of giardiasis is the Harris County Aquatic Center. So I'm going to break down this response a little bit more. So you see it's two sentences. The first sentence, I directly interpret what an odds ratio means. So basically it's good to have kind of this template almost ready to go when you're answering these types of questions. And beyond saying just that, sometimes it's also helpful to reinforce what you mean by that. So by saying that this high odds ratio makes it very likely that this Harris County Aquatic Center is probably the source of the outbreak. The only thing that I would caution you against doing is to definitively say that it is, because you can't really prove that unless you're doing like a experiment type of study. So, usually this is a good template to follow when you're answering these types of questions. So yeah, you guys are on a roll today. Lovely job. And then if there are no questions, oh, I'm gonna
Hey,
quickly.
Stephanie, before you move off, there is a question here about the 2x2 table. Is this the kind of thing they should always use for invitationals, or they should always use a 2x2 table when they're doing an odds ratio?
Yeah, so I'm not super sure what you mean by Abida, if what you mean by invitationals, but typically, yes, this is the structure that you use for 2x2 tables, regardless of if you're doing relative risk or odds ratio. So it's always going to be A, B, C, and D as from left to right, from top to bottom. Um, and for relative risk, the formula is A over A plus B, all divided by C over C plus D, whereas the odds ratio is AD over BC. And you can honestly just follow this 2x2 table template. And usually, if a question asks you to construct a 2x2 table, they will include all of the information you need to know in the question stem. So, for example, even if I didn't tell you that exactly 10 people didn't have giardiasis and visited the aquatic center, the question will still tell you that, for example, 37 total people visited the aquatic center. So you would just do 37 minus 27 to get 10. So just make sure that you look at what's given to you in the question and try to fill out that 2x2 table accordingly.
Hey, Stephanie,
Yeah.
Arwen threw in the chat here about how do we know where A, B, C, D is? So the information should be in the question stem, but how do you know where to put them in your table? Could
Yeah.
you go through that box again one more time?
For sure, for sure. Good question. So one format that I've found has typically worked for most of the competitions is you have your columns as diseased versus not diseased, and then your rows are exposed versus not exposed. So you can find this template online also very easily if you just Google 2x2 table and for epidemiology. And then A is always the 27 where I have that. B is always the 10 where I have that. C is always 7 where I have that. And D is always 30 where I have that. So once you fill out those numbers accordingly, you can just plug those into the formula. So yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit more. 2x2 tables can be a little bit confusing, so definitely would recommend practicing that as much as you can. Okay. Um, let me see. Great. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next part of the case study, which we're basically at the end. The next question is provide 5 recommendations to the Harris County Public Health Department to combat this outbreak. Again, feel free to be creative for these types of questions. There isn't like a single correct answer. As long as your answer is somewhat within the realm of possibility, you should get credit for it. I'm getting some good answers from you guys, which is great. Okay, awesome. Getting some really, really good answers. So, I'm gonna just share the ones that I thought about for this question. The first one would be to conduct a complete inspection of the Harris County Aquatic Center for potential contaminants. Secondly, is to temporarily close down the Harris County Aquatic Center to the public, make sure no one else gets the disease. Third, issue warnings to the public about preventing giardiasis. Fourth is to publicize information on treating and reporting cases of giardiasis. And then five is issue standard water safety protocols to prevent future outbreaks. So if you ever get stuck and if you can't think of another recommendation, just go with any recommendation that involves educating the public. So you can see that my three and four are basically both like variations of educating the public. So you could also come up with another variation of that. For example, you could say like help um, put up flyers of information on how people can contact their physician about GRDS or recognize signs of GRDS. So that's always kind of a little trick that I kept in my back pocket if I ever ran out of ideas for combating the outbreak, is to come up with one or more variations of educating the public. Pretty foolproof way to do that. Yeah, any of the other answers that you guys put in the chat seem to also work as well. So great, great. So thank you guys so much for your enthusiasm for this case study and for following along with the case study and answering my questions. This is really, really, really fun for me as well. Okay, so I'm gonna take a quick look and see if you guys had any questions about the uh, case study. Okay, so someone asked, would saying what an individual could do, like washing hands, count? I think yes, in a way, but I would want you to be more specific than just washing hands. So more you want to demonstrate your understanding of the disease and kind of how public health control measures can be instituted. So instead of just saying washing your hands, you could turn that around to say educating the public about the importance of sanitation and cleanliness in public spaces, something like that. That would probably be a full credit answer. Okay, I'm getting some questions about the difference between a retrospective and a prospective cohort study. Really good question. So like I mentioned earlier, retrospective versus prospective, those terms are related to timing. So retro means past and pro means into the future. So prospective cohort studies, you start with identifying a group of individuals who have a certain exposure. So for example, if you're looking at smoking versus lung cancer, you'd start off with a group of individuals who are frequent smokers. And then you'd probably also have a group of people who aren't frequent smokers. And then you'd follow them over time, probably over a period of many years. And then at the end of the study period, you'd see how many of those smokers had lung cancer, and then how many of those non-smokers had lung cancer, and then you'd compute the relative risk. So you can see what we're doing, right? We're following those people over time, and we're not going backwards in time. So that's a prospective cohort study. On the other hand, a retrospective cohort study, you could think of it as the same thing. We could still use the smoking and lung cancer analogy. So in this case, you wouldn't be following people over time. You would just be identifying people who are frequent smokers, and then you identify people who are not, and then you'd perhaps look at their medical records to see, do these people have lung cancer? Do they have a history of lung cancer? And then that way you will compute the relative risk. And yeah, so it all just depends on the timing. Okay, so I'm getting some questions about what does the statistical analysis for a cohort study look like? So I'm going to go back to my slide about A, B, C, and D, and I can explain it a little bit better. Okay, so for a cohort study, it's A over A plus B, so 27 over 37, all divided by C over C plus D, so 7 over 37. And that will give you your relative risk. Okay. And then some questions on, okay, yeah, I think that's, thank you guys again so much for your involvement with this case study. I'm gonna go ahead and move on to my final slide, which is about the real world implications of disease detectives and why, in my opinion, it is such an important event to be competing in and why I want to give you guys all major props for doing that. So obviously we all lived through COVID, and during COVID, many of you guys probably saw that there was a lot of talk about epidemiological principles like basic reproduction number, like disease transmission, like herd immunity. You probably heard that one a lot in the news. Um, and different direct contact, indirect transmission, fomites, all of that was in the news very, very frequently. And if you were a disease detective competitor during that time, like I was, it was all very interesting to see the material that you were learning in your textbooks really come to real life. And I think Disease Detectives is a particularly pertinent event for students to be learning because public health is such a pertinent issue to every single person in the world. And whether it's COVID, whether it's the flu season every single year, um, there's always a ton that you can contribute to the world by being an informed citizen in the realm of public health. So, just to give you guys an example of my background and my story and why I'm so invested in disease detectives and why I love it so much. During COVID, because I was seeing all of these disease detectives terms that I was learning about, I felt like there was a need for students to better spread the messaging about these concepts to the general public and for the general public to be generally more informed about these concepts that we just spent the past hour discussing. However, even the textbooks that are available for epidemiology, they kind of require a bit of a learning curve, and they typically require someone who's already super invested in the event to really sit down and read and comprehend that information. So I felt like what was missing from the literature was an intro-friendly textbook that could really teach students and just general learners about the basic epidemiological concepts that they were hearing so often in the news. So that's kind of what motivated me to compile everything I've learned through disease detectives and put it in a textbook that was really intro friendly, has a really non-existent learning curve, I would say. It's anyone can pick it up and read it and try to learn epidemiology from it. And that's what you can see on the top right corner called Epidemiology Unmasked, which I wrote in 2020. So it's been about 5 years, which is crazy. But during that time, I think this was one of the most rewarding things that I could have done for myself and for my community. Um, and it would not have been possible without my involvement in Science Olympiad and without my involvement with disease detectives in particular. So then after writing the book, I felt like I wanted to spread that message even beyond that. So I had the opportunity to work with my teachers in school to really further the messaging of public health in our classrooms, and then taught a couple classes on epidemiology and public health. So that's just kind of my example of why Disease Detectives is so near and dear to my heart and why I would recommend everyone to think beyond just Disease Detectives as an event and how you can apply your knowledge into the real world. Um, and then after COVID, I've been also thinking a lot about the messages that I've learned through disease detectives and public health in particular, and about how health affects different demographic groups and different populations differently. And that can manifest in things like health disparities, um, and inequitable access to health or inequitable affordability of health. Sorry if that's not the right word for it, but um, I've been also working on research and advocacy for health disparities that all stemmed from my involvement with disease detectives and Science Olympiad. So that's all just to say that being involved in this event is an amazing, amazing thing that you're doing for yourself and for your community. And I would recommend you to definitely get involved in any public health endeavors that you can find yourself in. Um, and because you'll have a really great asset, which is a skill set in epidemiology and public health. So that's my spiel. But thank you guys so much for listening to this presentation. I'm gonna stick around for questions, and if you have to hop off, feel free to stay in touch with me and shoot me an email at stephaniewang@college.harvard.edu. And yeah, feel free to send any questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll spend some time answering them.
Hey everybody, let's give Stephanie a round of applause and thank yous before she starts to tackle some of the questions here in the Q&A. Again, if you would please put your questions in the Q&A because in that way they stick around. Unlike the chat where as more people put stuff, your questions kind of get lost. So Stephanie, I'll turn it back over to you. And if you have the Q&A up, I don't know where you want to start tackling stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I see a lot of your questions. I can kind of go down the line. Um, so Shalini, oh, this is all the way back to the case definition. She said, isn't suspected cause not supposed to be in the case definition? Um, Yeah, so there's different types of case definitions. There's suspected, probable, and confirmed. So you write a suspected case definition when you don't have information about the lab diagnosis, for example. So you're not sure exactly what it is. So you don't say, we think that the cause of this disease is giardiasis. That's typically not standard in a case definition, but it is good to include the symptoms like the ones that I mentioned there. And that would be an example of a suspected case definition where you're not completely sure what the cause is, but you have enough information to kind of pinpoint who could be classified as a disease. Or sorry, as a case, my bad. Okay. Eugenia asks, what can I do on a daily basis? I'm assuming to get better at disease detectives. Um, I would recommend kind of following my four-step protocol. I'm gonna go back to that. Sorry. This one was, sorry, one second. Here, okay. So this is kind of what I did on a daily basis when I was preparing for disease detectives. Read, do practice exams, keep that rolling doc of content that I would review every single day, recognize and solidify the patterns that keep popping up throughout different practice tests that I would take, add that information into my notes, rinse and repeat. So definitely that's the strategy that worked for me. Although, if there's a strategy that works better for you, please follow that. These are just some suggestions that I have for people who are just getting started. Okay. Um, what should I put on my cheat sheet, and do you have any example ones? Uh, for your cheat sheet, I think you should reserve that for information that may be difficult to memorize. So what I mean by that is if you have certain formulas that you have trouble memorizing, like relative risk or odds ratio, you can put that in there. If you have examples of certain answers or questions that are asked really commonly on tests, so for example, like what are 5 reasons why we should investigate this outbreak? Maybe put that in your notes. If you have general topics like surveillance, or if you have general topics like prevention, the levels of prevention or the levels of immunity that you find it hard to memorize, or you just want more information about each, you should put those in your notes. Um, and again, like I said, anything that you put in your notes, you should already have learned, and that you have your notes solely as a tool to help you write down things in a fast manner when you're on competition day. Okay. Oh, sorry, one second. For the case definition, do I have to put the date and place at the top and then put the case definition below that? No. So for the case definition, you typically would put it as, where is it? I'm sorry, I have so many animations, but here. So an example of what you would write for this case definition would be hospital patients in Harris County, Texas, who experienced cough, fever, chills, shortness of breath, muscle aches, headaches, or diarrhea in July of 2017. So that would be a great example of what you can write for that answer. But of course, you can kind of move around the information. You don't have to say the person and place first. You don't have to say the clinical information in that order. But as long as you have those four criteria in there, you should be good. Nancy asked, do we have to know about people who discover diseases and are important, or is the test just giving cases that we have to solve? Um, so there's a lot of variation in disease detectives or any study event test that you'll see depending on the level that you're at. So, for example, maybe at a national level tournament, you may have more comprehensive questions that are asked of you than at, say, a regional or an invitational tournament. So, and sometimes it's hard to predict exactly what kind of question that you'll be asked, which is honestly what makes Science Olympiad so fun because you get to really delve deep into the literature and learn, become an expert in that topic. So, whatever you can find about epidemiology, whether it be about like important epidemiologists, there's no harm in learning those topics. Someone asked, isn't retrospective cohort study just a case control study? Not quite, because all cohort studies follow that general pattern of going from exposure to outcome, and all case control studies follow that general structure of going from outcome to exposure. So it's kind of the opposite in terms of who you start with and what you end with. But you're correct in that both of them are retrospective, as in they go back in time. So, I always run out of tests. Sorry, I always run out of time when doing the tests. What do you suggest I do? This is a really, really great question. I think it's really common for people to struggle with timing, and I remember I certainly did. Um, so one thing that I would say would help you a lot is if you identify kind of have a general idea of the structure of the test that you're given. So for example, a lot of tests will have like a definition section and then they'll have like a general knowledge section and then they'll have a couple case studies with it. So right off the bat, before I usually even start taking the test, I have a good understanding of what the structure is like. And then I want to know where most of the points are. So if most of the points are in the case studies, I don't want to spend 80% of my time in the definitions or the general information, right? I want to strategize. And so maybe that means giving up some portions of the definitions or giving up some portions of the general information to really concentrate my efforts on where the most points are. So kind of managing your time and making sure that you know where to focus would be good. And that's kind of where teamwork and communication with your partner comes in as well, because you guys can strategize together based on your strengths. So if one of you guys is like gung-ho on case studies, then have that person prioritize that section. If another one of you guys is just a content master for epidemiology, then you know that maybe the general information is like the good place to start for you. But a lot of communication and kind of strategizing would be, I think, my best advice for that.
Hey, Stephanie, can I piggyback on that as
Yeah.
well? So I totally agree with that. The other thing I would tell you is like make sure again you coordinate with your partner, but also two things to keep in mind. One, make sure at the beginning of the event you know what the tiebreaker questions are. And if the event supervisor doesn't tell you what the tiebreaker questions are, or they're not marked on the test, make sure you ask because even if you have to guess, you don't want to leave a tiebreaker question blank, right? You
Yeah.
always want to make sure you have an answer for a tiebreaker question, even if that means you skip over some stuff. The other thing, and this kind of gets to what Stephanie was talking about, if you think about the difference between some of the definitions and the content questions versus the case studies, a lot of times the definition stuff is going to be things like you have to know, right? You got to know it, or it's got to be on your notes page. If you know it's not a fact or it's not a piece of information that you've memorized, then you don't necessarily you aren't always able to figure that kind of stuff out. The advantage to the case study questions is that again it comes down to a process of like investigating an outbreak, investigating a case, and if you understand that process, you're in some ways better prepared, or you're going to have an easier time working the process on the case study than you may on remembering what disease John Drummond discovered, and why he's important to the role of epidemiology. So again, it's as Stephanie said, it's thinking about where you want to spend your time and where you can get the most bang for your buck.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. That's a really, really great point. Um, Especially test taking strategies. It's really good to invest in learning good test taking strategies so that you maximize your points on the actual test. Okay, couple questions about formulas. So attack rate. Attack rate is pretty similar to incidence rate, where you're basically looking at the number of new cases of a disease in a population and dividing that by the total population at risk. Now, the second part I said is kind of important. It's the population at risk, not everyone in the population. So, for example, if you're talking about a nosocomial infection, which primarily happens in the hospital, then you want to divide it by kind of the hospital population in question. But of course, it matters primarily based on the situation that you're given in the question. So that's attack rate. And then herd immunity. So herd immunity, I'm assuming what you're asking is the herd immunity threshold. Essentially, what that means is once you reach a certain high proportion of the population that's vaccinated or immune to the disease, whether through like a vaccine or through previous infection, then the rest of the population is kind of protected from getting the disease as well. And that threshold you can calculate using the formula 1 minus 1 over R. And R is the basic reproduction number. It's kind of like it's a pretty technical concept, but kind of the basic understanding of what R is the average number of cases that one person will kind of transmit. So if a basic reproduction number is 2, that means that on average, one person who has the disease will transmit it to 2 other people. Um, in a completely susceptible population. So we're talking about a population that does not have like lots of people vaccinated. So that's kind of the understanding of basic reproduction number and herd immunity. If you want to learn more about those concepts, any one of those 3 textbooks that I mentioned will go really in depth into those. So would recommend you to check that out. And then another question I get is, other than odds ratio and relative risk, what are measures of risk that we will see often on tests? Good question. I think the most common ones are probably going to be incidence rate and prevalence rate. Those are, pretty standard formulas that you can just get off of like the textbooks or online. Attack rate was also mentioned. And then there's also secondary attack rate, which is essentially attack rate but modified for people who kind of get it in the second wave. Um, and I think going through like a textbook and seeing the measures of risk that they use can help you have a really comprehensive picture. Okay. I think that's it for the questions that we're going to answer today. Um, but yeah, thank you guys so much once again for taking the time for this presentation and taking this opportunity to actively learn about disease detectives. I think it's such a rewarding event, like I mentioned, and I wish you guys all the best. And again, feel free to contact me if you have any questions. I'm going to just share my final contact information slide so you guys have that. There you go. So,
All right, everybody. Thank you, Stephanie. As always, like I love doing these because I learned some stuff and it's been awesome. So appreciate your help with this. Good luck with the rest of your semester at school. I hope everything goes well. And everybody, I wish you guys luck on the rest of your season. We're starting to get into regionals, and I know we got states coming up at the end of the month. So for some places. So best of luck to you guys. And like I said, you'll receive a link late tomorrow afternoon with access to the recording. We'll get the slides up on the workshop page at soinc.org. And yeah, if you're looking for other resources, definitely check out the event pages and the Science Olympiad website. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a great night.
thank you, everyone. Have a great night.